The woman in the faded coat has slept on this same train station bench for 7 winters, ignored, pitied, invisible. Until today. Today, a young woman storms in, clutching a single yellow envelope, and screams just one word: Mother. Every passenger stops. The old woman lifts her head for the first time, her eyes filling with fear, not hope. Because whatever is written inside that envelope, she already knows it will change everything she's been hiding all these years. It's not waiting if no one's coming. Is it? The memory came sharp tonight, though she hadn't asked it to. The feel of his hand leaving hers, years ago, right there on this platform, still burned her fingers if she thought too long. Even now, after 7 winters. Even now, with her coat fraying at the seams and her shoes cracked enough to drink the slush pooling under the bench. She told herself she'd only stay one more night, as she always did. But she didn't move. The train howled through like a wolf with no master, and she lifted her head just enough to watch it blur by. Wing tugged at her hair. The station lights flickered, as if unsure they should bother. She'd counted each 112 bulbs, 3 broken. That was the kind of thing you counted when silence stretched so wide you feared you'd vanish inside. Her bag sat on the ground beside her, the same battered leather with the broken clasp. Inside was only what she could carry: a tin of crackers, a hand mirror, a folded yellow envelope she never opened. That envelope had been handed to her by someone who didn't stay to watch her read it. She hadn't. Not yet. The bench creaked as she shifted. On the far end of the platform, 2 teenagers laughed behind cupped hands. Once, years back, she'd tried smiling at passers-by. But they all looked away too quickly, ashamed of something they didn't understand. So now she kept her head down. One more night, she whispered to herself, barely moving her lips. The echo of her own words startled her more than the cold. One more night. The whistle of another arriving train cut through her trance. She glanced up only because it was habit, only because it broke the silence. But what she saw next didn't make sense at first. A girl in a red coat stormed off the train and into the dim light, her hair wild in the wind, her cheeks slashed with cold red. It was always red that caught your eye here. The girl's boots clattered on the platform, too fast, too angry, and she was clutching something bright and yellow. No, not something, that envelope. The mother's stomach dropped so hard. She had to press her hand to the bench to steady herself. The girl's voice cut through the winter air like a blade. Lena. No one called her that anymore. Not here, not anywhere. Lena flinched at her own name, though she tried to disguise it in her breath. Sometimes it's not the letter that kills you, it's who delivers it. The girl stopped 3 feet away, chest heaving. Her knuckles were white around the envelope. You don't even ask where I've been? The girl demanded, her voice cracking. Lena wanted to say she couldn't. Her mouth just wouldn't form the words. The girl's hair whipped across her face, hiding her eyes for a moment. But then she yanked it back, baring her gaze like claws. You could have come home. You could have. She stopped herself, biting down hard on whatever else was about to spill. Lena finally forced her throat open. You shouldn't have come here, she murmured. Not in that coat. The girl glanced down at her red sleeves, confused, before understanding lit her face, half fury, half pain. You're still scared of him. It wasn't a question. It didn't need to be. A man on a nearby bench coughed loudly and walked away. The sound rang in the silence after. Lena's eyes drifted to the envelope in the girl's hand. That color, yellow like a bruise. Like the last time she saw him. His fingers on her neck, his breath in her ear as he said she was nothing if she left. I told myself, Lena said quietly, that if I stayed here long enough, maybe he'd forget. Or maybe I would. The girl stared at her, then shook her head, sharp, angry. That's what this is to you, forgetting? Lena swallowed, but her throat was dry. One more night, she said, softer now. That's what you always say. The girl stepped closer, holding the envelope out like a curse. "This is the last thing he ever wrote you." Lena's hand stayed glued to her knees. "Don't open it here," she whispered. The words barely carried. The girl froze, the wind catching her hair again. Her hands trembled now, though she tried to hide it. And suddenly, the mother saw it, the same fear, mirrored in her daughter's eyes. For the first time, Lena noticed how thin the girl's fingers were. She remembered those same hands, smaller. Then, gripping her skirt as they fled down the back stairs all those years ago, as she thought, she came back anyway. Even knowing, something small and sharp twisted in her chest. "You don't have to be like me," Lena murmured. The girl barked. A laugh that didn't sound like laughter. "Too late," she said. The station speaker crackled overhead, announcing another train. Neither of them moved. The envelope between them seemed heavier than it should. "If justice still matters, you'll want the next page." Lena reached slowly this time and took it from her. The paper felt warm from the girl's palm. The girl looked away as she handed it over. And for just a flicker, Lena saw it, that wound raw and red beneath all the anger. The girl had gone back, faced him, delivered this. And she'd carried it here, to the same bench, knowing what it meant. "Go home," Lena whispered. The girl's chin trembled, though she tried to lift it in defiance. Lena didn't look up again. Her fingers traced the edge of the envelope, feeling the seam as though it could tell her something. The train roared in and out of the station. Passengers shuffled past them. Someone dropped a coin that rolled in a circle before falling still. Lena didn't move. The envelope rested in her lap, heavy as stone. She would not open it here. She would not let him see her fall. But when she finally raised her eyes, the girl was already walking away, red coat vanishing into the winter fog. Lena stayed seated, her breath uneven, her fingers tight around the envelope. She whispered one last time, just for herself, "Not here." The lights above her flickered again and went out. "We don't leave scars. We leave questions." 7 winters ago, she stood on the same platform with 2 suitcases and a baby swaddled so tightly it could barely move. Her hands had been shaking. Then too, though she'd blamed it on the cold. The station clock said 1:17 a.m. The air had smelled of salt and metal, and in the glass of the ticket window she caught her own reflection, hair neat, lipstick perfect, shame stitched into every corner of her posture. Even then, she told herself it was temporary. A few nights, no more. Miracles don't come to those who stay still. But miracles didn't come at all. The memory of that night came back like a frostbite ache as she sat on her bench now, years later. The same bench, though the paint had chipped more, though her coat had thinned. Her knees touched, her shoulders curled forward, as if the wind might tear her apart if she made herself any bigger. The baby, her daughter, was long grown. Grown enough to wear her own red coat and throw her mother's name back at her. Tonight the platform was quiet, except for a man far off eating peanuts, shells cracking sharp between his teeth. She could still hear his voice when the wind caught just right, soft and low. "You're nothing without me." That was the first lie he ever told her. The second came on the night everything split open. She remembered packing the baby's blanket into her suitcase, fingers trembling as she pressed it between her skirts. She didn't take jewelry. Not the gold chain he gave her on their wedding day. Not the locket he'd slipped into her pocket the day she told him she was pregnant. She left it on the dresser, its clasp broken. A silent little rebellion she was too afraid to say aloud. Later, she would regret that. She had fled through the kitchen door, past the sound of his laugh in the living room, past the soft hush of her own mother's voice on the phone. She remembered that detail, too, the way her mother's back stayed turned even as the baby began to cry. Even now, all these years later, she wondered what her mother had been saying on that call, and to whom the suitcases had thudded against her legs as she ran. She didn't look back, but here on the bench tonight, the memory did the looking for her. The locket was still there, she knew, just as broken, just as sharp inside. A train hissed into the station and left again without stopping. Its light carved through the fog before fading. She didn't move. On the floor at her feet sat an envelope, yellowed and already creased at the edges. Delivered to her days ago by a stranger with two kind eyes. She hadn't opened it yet. She told herself shame was cheaper than truth, safer. But sometimes, in the long hours before dawn, she wondered if the letter didn't just hold the truth. Maybe it held the question she'd been running from. If justice still matters, you'll want the next page. Her hands found her lap, fingers weaving into each other until her knuckles went white. Across the platform, a boy and girl chased each other through a puddle, laughter echoing against the concrete. She watched them, then looked away, the locket. The echo of her own pride. The day he gave it to her. "For my love who saved me," he'd said, though he'd already started cheating then. She just hadn't wanted to see it. And later, when she found him with her sister in the kitchen, her sister, lipstick smudged on his collar, the locket had lain on her chest like a brand. That night she'd wanted to tear it off, but she hadn't. She'd smiled. Smiled because her mother stood there watching, and that was the night she learned what kind of woman she really was. The train station clock ticked softly now. Her breath came in thin white clouds. Pride had made her small. Love had made her suspicious. And suspicion had made her silent. A shadow passed across her bench. The peanut-eating man tossed his empty bag and left. Alone again. She reached into her coat pocket and felt the locket. She'd taken it back after all, years later, when she returned to clean out the house. Its broken clasp still wouldn't hold. She thought about his face then, lying in that hospital bed at the end, how thin his wrists looked, how afraid he'd been when he saw her in the doorway. That was the first time she'd seen his fear naked. It didn't feel like justice. It didn't feel like anything. Maybe that was her revenge, she thought. Not the running, not the silence, but this coming back later, calm, holding his locket in her palm as he looked at her and understood what it cost to be forgotten. The letter on the floor caught her eye again, her daughter's handwriting. Even now she couldn't bring herself to open it, because shame, she whispered to herself, is cheaper than truth, and safer. But tonight, she thought she might finally be wrong about that. On the far end of the platform, the boy and girl's laughter had faded. She closed her hand around the locket and felt the sharp edge bite into her skin. Her mother's voice came back to her now, faint but clear. "We don't leave scars. We leave questions." She'd never understood what that meant. Until now. The station lights buzzed and dimmed above her. And in the hush before the next train arrived, she leaned forward, picked up the envelope, and stared at it like it was the only thing that had ever mattered. But shame, it turns out, was never hers to carry. "It's heavier than it looks, isn't it?" Her mother's voice cracked as she said it, though her fingers never left her lap. The envelope lay between them on the bench, like a dare neither wanted to claim. The daughter stared down at it, her red coat catching what little light the station had to offer. Her breath came quick, each cloud breaking against the silence her mother kept building, brick by brick. With every minute she refused to speak. The daughter hadn't come here to wait, but she was waiting anyway. 7 winters had passed since she'd stormed out of the house with nothing but a backpack and her father's watch strapped to her wrist, too angry to notice her mother wasn't behind her. 7 winters of telling herself she didn't care why. 7 winters of hearing whispers in the family that her mother was mad, that she'd stayed on this bench because she was broken. But broken people didn't look this calm. Her mother sat small, hands folded as if she were praying to something that had long stopped listening. The daughter's fingers tightened on the envelope. "You're not going to tell me, are you?" she asked, her voice low. Her mother only flinched. "There's nothing so loud as a silence that chooses you." The daughter studied her, really looked this time. The tattered coat, the hair she'd once kept pinned into a perfect bun now loose. and streaked with gray. The same cracked leather bag she'd carried when she ran, and under her collar, faint but visible even now, a pale scar cutting down from her ear to her throat. The daughter swallowed hard at the sight. You always said. You fell. Still no answer. The girl's voice rose, splintering. God, just say it. Tell me he did it. Tell me it was him. Her mother blinked, then finally met her eyes. The fear there was older than either of them. The girl's hand shook as she waved. The envelope between them. This is his handwriting, isn't it? Her mother's lips barely moved, but she gave the smallest nod. The daughter's face crumpled in something she would never call grief. You stayed here all these years, she said bitterly, for him. Her mother opened her mouth, then closed. The daughter let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. You left me. You stayed here with your ghosts and left me to wonder what I did wrong. But it was never about me, was it? It was always about him. The mother's hands finally unfolded. Slowly, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled something out. A locket, the chain broken, but the pendant whole. She let it sit in her palm, and though her gaze was still soft, her voice came hard this time. You think I stayed for him? The daughter froze. Her mother's fingers closed around the locket. I stayed because of you. Because if I went back, if I so much as showed my face in that house, he would have found you next. You don't know what he was capable of. The daughter's eyes widened. But you left me. Her mother's mouth trembled, and for a moment she looked every inch the child she must have once been, someone who never quite learned how to choose between pride and survival. I thought, she whispered, if I stayed out of the way, they'd let you grow up clean, without all this, on you. She looked down then, at her lap, at the scar hidden beneath her collar. But even ghosts leave fingerprints. If you stay still long enough. The daughter's throat felt tight. You think you get to decide what I carry? She said. You don't. Not anymore. You left me questions and no answers. And now you're going to sit here and tell me I can't even read what he wrote. Her mother finally looked at her, and there was something brittle in her eyes now. I'm begging you, she said hoarsely. Don't read it here. Not where they can hear. The girl stared at her, confused. Who? Her mother didn't answer. But something in the way she gripped the locket, so tight her knuckles whitened, made the daughter pause. For the first time she wondered what her mother had heard on this bench. What names had been spoken in passing? What threats had hummed through the cold night air? But the daughter was too far gone to stop now. She slid her thumb under the flap of the envelope. You don't control me anymore, she whispered. Her mother's eyes glistened. You don't understand, she said, almost pleading now. There are names in there you don't say aloud. Not if you want to stay safe. But the daughter's fingers kept moving. Safe from what? She asked bitterly. Safe from the truth? If justice still matters, you'll want the next page. Mother closed her eyes as the paper tore. And in her mind, she saw it all at once. Drawers she'd kept locked, birth certificates she'd stolen, a name she'd scratched out of every record she could find. But the daughter didn't see those memories. She saw only the words, and then her face went pale. Her breath caught. The letter slipped from her fingers to the floor, landing like an accusation. The daughter stepped back, eyes wide and hollow. The mother stayed still. The words hung between them now, though neither dared speak them aloud. Because sometimes a name is heavier than the person who wears it. You can't bury someone who's still alive. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Her daughter froze, the torn envelope still clutched in her hand, and looked at her with a sharpness that stung. The train station had emptied to a hush now, just the two of them, and the echo of her own confession hanging in the stale air. Her mother sat stiff-backed on the bench, eyes fixed on the cracked tile floor, as if the story she'd kept buried for decades might crawl out through those cracks if she dared to meet her daughter's gaze. Her hands worried at her coat sleeve. A loose button caught between her fingers. the thread unraveling like something she could never quite repair. "You want answers?" she said finally, voice low. "Fine, you'll get them. But you won't. Like where they came from." Her daughter said nothing, though her breath quickened, white puffs in the chill. The mother's eyes closed. And in her mind she was 19 again, standing barefoot in her mother's kitchen, biting the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling while her husband-to-be smoothed a finger across her knuckle and slipped a silver ring on her hand. That's simple. A boy who called her darling, who opened doors and brought her roses. She thought kindness was a promise you could take to the bank. And for a little while, it was. She opened her eyes and stared at the empty tracks. "You think it started when you were born," she murmured. "But it didn't. It started before that. The day I told him I was pregnant," and his smile cracked, like I'd ruined something I didn't even know he'd been building. It's always the smallest crack that brings the whole house down. Her daughter shifted beside her, the envelope crackling faintly. "He changed," her mother went on. "Not all at once, just little things. A slammed door instead of a shut one. A hand too tight on my arm when I spoke too loud. Then lies, stories that didn't make sense. Receipts in his pockets that didn't belong to me. Nights when he didn't come home at all." Her hands stilled on her lap. "And then one afternoon," she said, voice almost breaking, "I opened the old bedroom drawer, the one you weren't supposed to touch, and inside I found it, his secret, carved right into the wood like it was a name on a grave." Her daughter's brow furrowed. "A name?" The mother nodded, eyes gone far away now. "Ruth." The words sat heavy between them. Her fingers traced her scar through the fabric of her coat, as if remembering the night she'd asked him about it and paid for the question. His eyes had gone glassy, his mouth flat and cold as he'd raised his hand, but the photo hid something worse. She never told her daughter about the photograph she found under the drawer's lining. A young woman with her same timid smile, the same locket she now carried around her own neck. Ruth, not just a name, but a shadow. The woman he'd married before her. The woman he'd never spoken of. The mother's nails dug into her palm. "She was here before me," she said faintly. "And he buried her alive, not in the ground, but in a way no one could see. Took her name, her life, and locked her in some place I couldn't find." The daughter's lips parted, but no sound came. "And when I told him I knew," her mother said, voice darkening, "he told me I'd end up just like her if I ever breathed a word." Her breath hitched. "I thought I could protect you if I stayed quiet, if I just played along. I thought silence was enough. But silence is just another kind of coffin. Even buried things find a way to crawl back up through the dirt." Her daughter sat rigid, her red coat vivid against the gloom. She turned the envelope over and over in her hands, her fingers shaking now. Her mother's eyes softened as she looked at her. "I thought he'd let you grow up clean," she whispered, "that he'd never touch you the way he touched us." The daughter's chin quivered. "You knew," she said, quiet at first, then louder, jagged. "You knew who Ruth was and you stayed?" Her mother flinched. "I stayed because I didn't know how to leave. And when I finally figured it out, it was too late, for me. But not for you." She let the broken button drop from her hand. "I thought he'd forget, or at least pretend. But Ruth was always here, in every locked drawer, every lie. If justice still matters, you'll want the next page." The daughter ripped the envelope open, hands clumsy, desperate. "No," her mother said sharply, reaching for it. "Not here, please." But her daughter didn't stop. "You don't get to tell me what's inside," she spat. The mother froze, her breath shallow. The sound of paper tearing filled the silence, and then the daughter's eyes dropped to the letter. She read the first line and gasped. Her fingers loosened. The paper fluttered to the ground, like something burning. Her daughter's voice cracked. through the quiet, soft but jagged as glass. Ruth? Who's Ruth? She waited, and waited, and waited. She used to sit at the kitchen table every afternoon after school, her little legs swinging under the chair, listening for the sound of keys in the door. She would fold her homework paper into a perfect square and set it in the center of the table, next to the chipped mug her mother used for tea. She would line up the sugar packet so everything was ready, but the keys never came. The sun would sink through the blinds, striping her arms in pale light and shadow, and the house would settle into silence. She would count to 100, just in case. Then another 100. She would whisper, "She'll come home." She just has to, even now years later, shuttled between names and houses that were never hers. She could still feel the grooves in that table, still hear the radiator groaning in the walls, still see the faint lipstick smear on the rim of that mug. Love turns to suspicion the moment it's forced to wait too long. By the time she was 12, she stopped setting the table. At 14, she stopped calling it home. By 16, she stopped asking the question aloud, but it never left her. Why? In every foster home, she carried it in her chest like a splinter, something you couldn't pull out without bleeding. She learned not to leave too much of herself anywhere, not to hang her clothes in the closet, not to stick posters on the walls, not to make friends she couldn't keep. People noticed that about her sometimes, how neat she kept her things, how quickly she packed her bag when it was time to leave. They said she was easy. They said she never cried, but they didn't see how many nights she sat awake staring at the ceiling, tracing her own name on the sheet with her finger, wondering if her mother had even said it in years. She kept a torn receipt in her wallet, a grocery slip with her mother's handwriting on the back. Milk, bread, stay. She told herself it meant something, but the photo hid something worse. When she turned 19 and aged out of the system, she went back to that kitchen table. The house was empty by then, the walls yellowed and the windows broken, but the mug was still there on the counter, the lipstick faint but still visible. She ran her thumb across it until her skin went raw, and she whispered, "Why?" It wasn't until she took a job cleaning at the county archives that she thought to look for answers. The clerk behind the desk barely noticed her when she came back after hours to sort through the old paper files. She'd carry stacks into the back room and sit on the floor, dust rising around her, eyes stinging as she read. She started with her own file and flinched when she saw how thin it was. One sheet. Name, date of birth, next of kin, unknown. She read it over and over, the word unknown digging under her skin. Then she opened her mother's file. It was thicker, clippings, statements, a restraining order, notes scribbled in the margins that made her stomach clench. And at the very back, tucked into a manila envelope, was a folded letter. It didn't belong there. Her name was written on the front. Not the name of the clerk, not some case number. Her name. In her mother's handwriting. The truth is heavier when it's written by someone you love. Her hands shook as she held it, and for a long time she just stared at it, afraid to read it, afraid not to. Her mother's handwriting looked smaller. Then she remembered. Uneven. There was a lipstick smudge in the corner of the page. She remembered that mug, that chipped kitchen table. She thought of all the time she'd whispered "why" into her pillow. The paper felt thin, too thin to hold everything it might carry. Even now she thought, maybe it's better not to know. Maybe some things stay broken because we wouldn't survive putting them back. But her fingers didn't stop. She unfolded it. The words were quiet, sparse, and sharp. Enough to cut. Your father is not who you think. The page slipped from her hands and settled on the floor like a whisper. Secrets don't rot when you keep them in wood. That's what her mother used to say when she was little, whenever she caught her staring at the old oak drawer in the bedroom desk. She would run her hand across the polished surface and whisper, It almost kindly, as if she wasn't really speaking to her at all. Tonight, alone in the house with only the moon pressing through the window, she said it again. This time to herself. The drawer sat quiet and unassuming under her fingers, the same way it had for years, its brass handle dulled, the keyhole no wider than a pinprick of darkness. She dusted it every week without fail, pretending it was just a drawer like any other, pretending she hadn't already found the key years ago, pretending it didn't hum under her palms whenever she stood too close, daring her to look inside. But tonight, she couldn't pretend. She'd waited until she was sure he wouldn't come home early. Waited until the walls stopped holding their breath. Waited until she could hear her own heartbeat louder than anything else in the room. Now the key burned cold in her palm, its teeth catching the moonlight as she lowered it toward the lock. It's strange how betrayal smells, faintly of cedar and dust. The lock turned with a quiet click that still made her flinch. For a moment, she couldn't bring herself to pull it open. Her hand hovered. Her breath felt too loud that she thought of him. How he always kissed her on the cheek when he left, just soft enough to convince her he meant it. How he let her wear his jacket when she got cold at church. How he laughed in the mornings like nothing in the world could touch them. It was pride that kept her from opening it all those years. She'd been so sure she'd picked well. So sure her mother was wrong when she warned her what a man with empty eyes could do. She thought love could outlast suspicion. She thought it could. Her fingers curled under the drawer's edge and pulled. The wood groaned as it slid open. Inside, everything was neat, too neat. Folders stacked with labels in his handwriting. A single envelope resting on top with her name in blue ink. She didn't pick it up. Instead, she took the first folder and opened it. Receipts, plane tickets, hotel confirmations. She didn't understand at first. Not until she saw the photos. Paper clipped to the back. Him and another woman. A woman with long dark hair, who smiled like she belonged to him. They were standing in front of a little white house she'd never seen before. And in the corner of the frame a child, a boy no older than 6, clinging to the woman's skirt. The boy was wearing the sweater she'd knitted the winter before. She dropped the folder. Her knees felt weak, so she sat down on the edge of the bed. The envelope still sat there in the drawer, waiting for her. Her name in his careful slanted script. She almost didn't want to touch it, but her fingers betrayed her, curling around the flap, pulling it open. The letter was only a few sentences. No apology. Just instructions. By the time you read this, everything will already be filed. The house is no longer in your name. The accounts have been moved. Do not make this ugly. I'll make sure you have enough to leave quietly. There's no reason for the children to know what you are. Her breath left her all at once. What you are. Her hands trembled as she set the paper down. Underneath the envelope was one more folder. She knew she shouldn't open it, but she did. A will. Signed and notarized, her name crossed out, the other woman's name written in, and the boy. Her children's inheritance split down to the penny with someone they'd never met. She let the folder fall from her hands, scattering papers across the floor. The moonlight caught on a photo that landed face up near her foot. It was him. Alone this time. But his smile looked different. Not proud, not cruel. Just tired. She stared at it for a long time. That was the thing about him, wasn't it? Even now, when she should hate him enough to burn the house to the ground, she could still see it. That small, quiet fear at the edges of his eyes. She remembered the night she told him she was pregnant. How he'd gripped her hand too tightly, like someone drowning. How he'd buried his face in her neck and whispered, "Don't leave me, not you." And she remembered thinking, he's broken in a way that only love can fix. But she was wrong. Her fingers brushed the scar at her collarbone. Hidden by her blouse, she gathered the scattered papers and slid them back into the drawer. One by one, she locked it again and set the key on the nightstand. If justice still matters, You'll want the next page. When she finally lay back on the bed, she stared at the ceiling and thought about how easy it would be to slip away before he came home, to leave everything just as he planned. But something inside her refused, because secrets don't rot. When you keep them in wood, they wait, and then they splinter. Her eyes drifted to the locket on the dresser, the one he gave her on their wedding day. She picked it up, opened it, and looked at the photo inside. Her own face stared back, young, hopeful. She snapped it shut. And when the front door creaked open downstairs, she didn't move. She stayed where she was, holding the locket tight in her fist. And whispered into the dark, "He said he'd kill me if I told. There's always someone watching." The words came from behind her, like the scrape of a match in a dark room. She turned slow, her breath fogging in the chill of the cafe. The man stood just inside the door, hands sunk deep in the pockets of his janitor's jacket, his cap pulled low over his eyes. He was older than she'd expected, older than time maybe. The kind of man who seemed carved from the station itself, stooped, worn, yet still here. He nodded at the chair opposite her. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no. The chair squealed faintly as he sat, and for a moment the only sound between them was the clink of her spoon in her coffee. "I remember you," he said finally. His voice was soft, but it carried. "Little girl with the big eyes. The one who used to come looking for her." Her fingers stilled on the cup. "I wasn't looking," she said, though even to her own ears it sounded like a lie. The man smiled faintly. "You were," he said. "Everyone looks, even when they say they don't." She stared into her coffee. The cream swirled, pale and chaotic. He leaned back, the chair groaning under his weight. "She sat on that bench," he murmured. "Every night, 7 years straight. You'd think people would stop noticing after a while, but they didn't. Not really." He rubbed his knuckles, slow, as though remembering hurt. "Crying woman. That's what they called her. And the man who made her bleed." Her breath caught before she could stop it, because she'd never heard anyone else say it out loud. She looked up, searching his face for something, malice, pity, anything. But he just looked tired. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. His gaze shifted to her hands, and only then did she realize she'd been gripping the first envelope so hard it had left creases in her palm. He let out a breath, long and uneven. "Because you deserve to know." She shook her head, almost laughed. "I already know what he did." The man tilted his head at her, as if seeing straight through her. "You think you do," he said. She hated the way those words settled in her. "Don't," she said. "Don't try to make me feel sorry for him. Don't tell me some story about how he was broken too." But even as she said it, something in her chest tightened, because part of her already knew. The janitor's hand reached into his jacket and pulled something out. A photograph, edges frayed. He slid it across the table. She stared down at it. A boy, maybe 12, standing on the edge of a cracked porch. His eyes were dark, hollow. His shirt hung off one shoulder, and his lip was split. Behind him, a man's shadow stretched long across the wood. He grew up in a house worse than this station, the janitor said. She swallowed hard but said nothing. The man's voice softened, almost a whisper. "You can only take so many beatings before you start handing them out yourself. It's hard to hate someone when you see the boy they used to be." She hated that the photo made her chest ache. She pushed it back toward him. "That doesn't excuse it." His mouth twisted. "Not quite a smile, not quite anything." "No," he said. "It doesn't." But the image of that boy clung to her mind anyway. She reached into her bag, pulling out her mother's locket, and set it on the table. It swung gently, catching the light before settling flat. The janitor's eyes lingered on it. "You planning to keep carrying it?" he asked. She stared at the locket. The crack in its clasp, the faint dent from the night her mother finally tried to leave. "I thought revenge would feel better," she admitted. The janitor studied her a long time before answering. "It never does," he said. She looked down again, and for the first time she noticed a faint scar running along the back of his hand. Not all wounds heal. Some just harden into something you learn to hide. If justice still matters, you'll want the next page. The janitor rose, his chair groaning again. He stood for a moment, then reached into his jacket once more. This time he pulled out another envelope, thicker than the first. He placed it gently on the table. Her name was written on the front, in her mother's hand. Her throat tightened as she stared at it. The janitor's eyes met hers one last time. "Your mother never saw this one," he said, and then he walked away, leaving her alone at the table, the second envelope waiting in silence. The truth isn't enough to win. You still have to swing. The words slipped out before her daughter even sat down. The mother said them low, more to herself than anyone else, but they hung in the station air like a dare. The girl froze for a breath, then sank into the seat. Across from her, eyes rimmed red but steady now. The corner they chose was quiet, hidden from the echo of trains and footsteps, though not from memory. Memory didn't need sound to shout. The same cracked tile underfoot, the same flickering light overhead that buzzed like a wasp trapped behind glass. The same bench where her mother had sat all those nights silent, waiting, unraveling one strand at a time. On the table between them lay two envelopes. One creased, faintly torn at the edge from years of hiding. The other thick and clean, its flap sealed with a care that chilled her fingers just to touch it. The mother's hand hovered over the old one, then pulled back. Her daughter's hand didn't tremble. Not anymore. She tore the first envelope open. The sound of paper ripping is louder when you know it's a heart inside. She spread the pages out in a neat row, though her eyes wanted to turn away. Divorce papers. Unsigned, but dated nearly a decade ago. Her mother's name written in careful, cool legal script. A birth certificate with blacked out lines. A paternity test stapled behind it, the kind that leaves no room for questions. And last a note. His handwriting, "I'm not sorry. I did what I had to." The mother reached out, fingertips grazing the confession as though it might burn her. Her throat worked around words she didn't say. "He filed these," her daughter said quietly. The mother nodded once, eyes wide, almost vacant. "They came from me," she murmured, and her voice cracked. "One morning I woke to find my dresser drawers emptied. My name struck from the account. The locks changed." She pressed her palm against the table to stop its shaking. But the photo hid something worse. Her daughter frowned faintly at that, but said nothing. The mother let the silence thicken before she went on. "That night, he came to the station and sat across from me. Told me it was over. Said I could stay here and rot for all he cared. Said her eyes filled, but she refused to blink. Said I wasn't even the mother of his child." Her daughter stared at her then, unblinking, her hands fisted in her lap. "And you believed him?" The girl said it wasn't a question. The mother's pride shrank into something small. She'd held onto it so long, but sitting here now she could barely lift her head under its weight. She nodded. "I believed him," she whispered. For a moment they both stared at the papers on the table, the proof of what they'd both already known, but never spoken. Then her daughter's gaze hardened, like ice forming over a river. "Not anymore," she said, and reached for the second envelope. "If justice still matters, you'll want the next page." She broke the seal with her thumb, slid the papers out. Another note, in her mother's handwriting this time, unread until now. Her mother's breath hitched when she saw it. She leaned forward, reading over her daughter's shoulder. It was a letter. To her, written years ago, but never sent. The mother's words wavered on the page, but their meaning cut clean. "If you ever find this before I can say it, you're mine. Every piece of you is mine. He couldn't take that. He tried. But I never signed anything that made it true. Don't believe his story, baby. Don't believe his blood over my love." The girl's tears welled, then stilled. "Why didn't you send it?" she asked, her voice low. Her mother flinched. "I thought," she trailed off. "Then, I thought you'd hate me for staying." The daughter turned the letter over in her hands. The locket on her mother's chest caught the light, swinging gently like it had something to say, but didn't dare. "Even after you cut the chain, it keeps swinging." Her daughter folded the note carefully, tucked it back into the envelope, and looked up. Her tears had dried into something sharper. "I'm going to him," she said simply. Her mother's fingers curled around the edge of the table. "And do what?" Her daughter's lips pressed into a line. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I can't let him think he won." The mother let her shoulders sag. Her pride gave way to something smaller and older. Fear, but beneath it something else. Resolve. The same resolve that had kept her on that bench all those nights. Whispering one more night into her hands, she reached for her daughter's wrist before she could stand. And in her touch was everything she hadn't said all these years. All her apologies. All her rage. All her love. The locket swung once more against her chest, and she whispered, "Take me with you. A home is just a trap with prettier curtains." She'd thought it the first night she ever slept here. Barely 17 and still smelling of soap and school. The curtains had been new then, ivory lace, fluttering faintly in the spring air, and she'd stood at the window in her wedding dress, staring at the yard below and feeling something she didn't yet know to call fear. Now, all these years later, she stood on that porch again with her daughter at her side, staring at the same window. The curtains had yellowed. The lace frayed into faint cobwebs. But the air still pressed against her chest like a hand. The daughter held both envelopes in her fist, edges soft from her grip. One bore her mother's name. The other bore his. The mother's locket swung at her throat, heavy as guilt. When the door finally opened, the husband stood there in his shirt sleeves, blinking like he'd just woken from a nap. For a moment his face was blank. Then came the smile, quick, shallow, and false. "Well," he said, stepping aside as though this were nothing, "look who's come crawling home." The only thing colder than his smile was how easily it fit his face. The daughter stepped in first. Her boots left faint scuffs on the hardwood, and she didn't stop in the foyer. She moved straight to the dining room table, the same table where he'd once kissed the back of her mother's hand in front of company, just so everyone would believe he loved her. The mother followed slower, each breath scraping her throat. The smell of dust and something faintly metallic wrapped around her like a shroud. The husband leaned in the doorway, arms folded, watching them both with a smirk. "Did you finally get tired of playing the martyr?" he said to her. "Or did you just miss me?" She looked at him, then really looked, and she saw what she hadn't let herself see all those years. The way his shoulders stooped now, how his hands trembled faintly, even when clenched into fists. The fear behind his eyes, buried under layers of habit and cruelty. For just a second, she almost pitied him. Then she remembered the scar at her collarbone. The way he'd laughed the night she left. She straightened. The daughter laid the first envelope on the table and slid it toward him. "Your copy," she said flatly. He didn't touch it. "What's this supposed to be?" "Everything you thought you'd buried," the daughter replied. The mother moved to the head of the table and sank into the chair where he used to sit. The wood creaked under her weight. She ran her palm across the surface, feeling the old scratches in the grain. "Tell her," the daughter said. The mother's gaze stayed on the table. Her fingers found one of the deeper grooves and traced it. "You told me I was nothing without you," she said quietly. His smile faltered. "You told me no one would believe me," she continued. "And for a long time, you were right." Her daughter's eyes glinted as she watched her mother speak. The mother lifted her head then, and her voice sharpened. "But you forgot something," she said. "Even a trap has a way out if you stop being afraid of bleeding." She nodded toward the envelope. "Go on," she said. "Read it." His jaw tightened. When he finally reached for it, his hands shook just enough for her to see. He tore it open and skimmed the first page. His lips moved as he read, his smirk slipping away line by line. Birth certificates, bank records, affidavits from the station janitor. Every lie he'd told folded neatly into words he could no longer swallow. But the photo hid something worse. The daughter's voice cut through the silence, soft and steady. The husband's eyes flicked to her, then back to the page. When he reached the end, he let the paper fall from his fingers. He tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. "You think this scares me?" he said. "You think you can hurt me with a few scraps of paper?" The mother's hand curled around her locket, thumb worrying at the dent in its clasp. Her daughter stood then, sliding the second envelope across the table. He froze before touching it. For the first time that night, his smile was gone. "This one's yours too," the daughter said, "but she's never seen it." The mother's breath hitched at that. She hadn't known that the husband didn't move right away. His eyes darted between them, his tongue wetting his lips. When he finally picked it up, his fingers fumbled at the seal. The mother watched his face as he unfolded the contents. And she saw it happen. The exact moment his cruelty cracked into. Something else. Shock. Then panic. Then something like grief. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Whatever he read on those pages, it stole the air from his lungs. His hands trembled harder now, and for the first time she noticed the faint scars. Across his knuckles, small white lines she'd once thought were from work. But maybe not. Maybe they were from a boyhood that hurt so much he never learned how to stop passing it on. He sank into the chair opposite her, staring at the paper as if it might change if he just kept looking. And then, very softly, he began to laugh. Not the same sharp laugh she'd known. This one was quieter. Broken. But the laughter died the moment his eyes caught hers again, because she wasn't afraid anymore. The daughter reached over then, pressing her hand on her mother's locket. And together they rose. The husband stayed seated, still gripping the second envelope, his knuckles white, his breath uneven. The mother didn't look back as they left the house, but the sound of his quiet, uneven laugh followed her into the night. What you don't say eats you alive. The thought came to her as she sat on the edge of the couch, hands folded in her lap, staring at the man she once loved. Her locket rested on her chest, still warm from her fingers gripping it earlier. It was quiet in the room but for the faint tick of the clock above the doorway and her daughter's soft breaths. Standing behind her, the second envelope lay open now, its contents spread across the coffee table like broken glass. Her husband stood by the window, his back to them, shoulders rigid. He'd laughed at first, but the laugh had cracked halfway through and never returned. He didn't turn around when he spoke. "This is nothing," he muttered. "It's just paper. Words on a page." The daughter lifted her phone, thumb hovering just above the record button. The mother noticed and didn't stop her. Even silence has a sound when you finally decide to listen. She studied him from where she sat, the way his left hand trembled slightly, how his breath came shallow and quick. It struck her that even now he couldn't bear to face her. He'd been so loud once, loud enough to drown her into herself. Now he couldn't even look. "You should have stayed gone," he said, his voice a notch softer this time. "You should have." "Let me," she replied, and her voice didn't shake this time. That startled him enough to make him turn. The mother flinched a little when his eyes met hers because they weren't hard the way she expected. They were scared. And somewhere in that fear she saw the boy he'd been. The boy who'd learned the hard way that love could turn to cruelty if you didn't strike first. But she didn't forgive him. Her daughter tapped her phone screen then. A faint red light glowed. And then, word by word, the mother spoke. "You lied about paternity," she said. "You hid her birth certificate. You froze my accounts, forged my name on contracts, struck me from the will. You kept her from me, but you couldn't keep the truth buried." She paused, letting her words fill the space between them. "You told me I was nothing without you. she said. But that was your fear, wasn't it? That I'd find out you were the nothing. He flinched like she'd struck him not. With her hands, but with the sound of her finally speaking, he stared at her for a long time, and for a moment his lips parted like he wanted to deny it. But nothing came out. Her daughter raised the phone higher and spoke for the first time. "You should know," she said, her tone even. "This is being recorded. Every word you say from here on out." The mother watched him swallow hard at that, and something ugly and raw flickered across his face. "Don't do this," he said, but it came out more like a plea than a command. Her daughter didn't lower the phone. The mother leaned forward, her locket swinging gently against her ribs. "You already did," she said. He took one step back, his heel knocking against the wall. The mother's voice softened, but she didn't stop. "I gave you everything," she said. "I let you make me small because I thought it would save her from you. I stayed quiet. I made excuses. I told myself it wasn't as bad as it felt." She let out a breath, sharp and thin, and all that silence just made you louder. Her daughter's fingers tightened around the phone. The mother stood then, for the first time in years. She stood taller than him. "If justice still matters, you'll want the next page." She reached for her locket, unfastened it, and placed it on the table between them. "I'm not ashamed anymore," she said. He blinked at her, and in his expression, she caught something fragile, like shame trying to bloom in a place it had never grown before. The mother turned to her daughter and nodded. Her daughter tucked the phone into her pocket and reached for her mother's hand. Together, they moved toward the door. Behind them, he stayed where he was, staring at the locket on the table, his shoulders sinking. The sound of their boots on the hardwood was steady, unhurried, final. And just as they reached the porch, red and blue lights began to dance faintly through the window, washing the living room in flickers of judgment and truth. The mother didn't look back, but she felt him finally look at himself. Sometimes justice wears a smaller name. She thought of that as she sat alone in the courthouse hallway, her palms pressed flat against her skirt. When she was 16, she thought justice was a mighty word, huge, clean, and shining. Now, with her locket warm against her skin and her knees shaking, she knew better. Justice was quiet. Justice wore chipped nail polish and a borrowed cardigan and carried the faint scent of fear in her hair. The doors opened, and they called her name. Her daughter was already inside, seated in the first row, her hands clasped tight, her phone resting face down on her knee like a shield. The mother caught her gaze for just a second and felt her own heart steady. The bailiff led her to the stand. Even the air seemed to hold its breath as she raised her hand to swear the truth. The courtroom was smaller than she'd imagined. Smaller than the kitchen she'd scrubbed on her hands and knees for a man who now sat at the defendant's table, his lawyer murmuring in his ear. She didn't look at him, not yet. The judge's voice was low, measured. The prosecutor's questions began like drops of water on stone, soft but relentless. Her name, her marriage, the year she first left, the scar. Her hands shook as she touched the scar just above her collarbone. That thin white line had faded, but in this light it caught just enough to glint a faint memory of pain that had shaped her whole. Silenced. Her daughter leaned forward, fingers twitching against the phone now. "Recording, always recording. They called it a domestic dispute," she said at last. "But it wasn't a dispute. I wasn't allowed to dispute anything." Her voice cracked on the word, but she did not stop. "I stayed," she went on, softer now. "I stayed because I thought my silence kept her safe. I thought if I took all of it, she wouldn't have to. That's what mothers do, isn't it?" She risked a glance then toward him, and in his eyes she saw not defiance, not rage, but something smaller, something close to shame. He didn't look at her for long. She realized he was afraid of her, now not her strength, but her words. Words he could no longer silence. "Would you like to read your victim statement?" the judge asked. Her daughter stood, bringing her the folded paper. Their fingers brushed. The daughter's hand was cool but steady. "I'm not invisible anymore," her daughter whispered before returning to her seat. The mother unfolded the paper. "It wasn't long. I was taught," she began, her voice low but growing stronger, "that a wife's duty was to forgive, to stay, to keep quiet for the sake of the family, and so I did. I stayed so long I forgot how to hear my own voice." The words blurred for a moment. She blinked them back. "But silence isn't love. Silence isn't forgiveness. Silence is just another kind of cage. And the more I stayed silent, the smaller I became, until the day I left and realized I still existed." She took a breath, fingers curling around the edges of the page. "He told me no one would believe me, that no one would care, but you hear me now, you see me now. And that is enough." Her voice didn't shake on the last line. "I am not invisible anymore." Her daughter's hand slid into hers just then, squeezing tight. The judge nodded, solemn. The prosecutor murmured something she didn't catch. She folded the paper back in half, placed it on the stand, and finally looked at him. For the first time, he looked smaller than her. Smaller than his shadow even. His hands were clutched in his lap, knuckles white, jaw tight as though to keep something from spilling out. And maybe, for just a breath, she almost felt sorry for him. He'd been raised to hurt before he was old enough to name it. He'd never learned to stop himself. But the photo hid something worse. She thought of the evidence, everything he'd done, everything she'd endured now cataloged in neat files and glossy images. And she thought of his face that night she'd left when he'd laughed through his teeth. Believing she'd never speak, she let go of the almost pity. The judge raised the gavel. "If justice still matters, you'll want the next page." The mother inhaled once, deep and certain. And when the gavel struck, it rang through the room like a heartbeat breaking free. She waited here until she didn't have to. The old wooden bench still groaned the same way under her weight, though she was lighter now, lighter in body, lighter in heart. The station smelled faintly of soap and snowmelt tonight. Not the heavy grit of winter's edge when she first made this bench her own. That first night, she'd been wearing a coat she couldn't button, clutching a torn receipt in her fist like it meant something. He had slammed the door behind her so hard the glass rattled. She'd sat here for hours in the dark, telling herself it was temporary, telling herself he'd come find her, telling herself she was the one who was wrong. Now she knew better. Tonight, her coat was clean, buttoned. She sat with her head held high, and her daughter sat beside her. The girl's presence still startled her sometimes. How much she looked like him, and yet how nothing in her eyes resembled him at all. They'd fought, once, over whether to open the yellow envelope. The mother had begged her not to. But in the end, the truth had spilled anyway. Birth certificates, the bank statements, even that photo no one was supposed to have. But the photo hid something worse. The daughter's fingers toyed with the envelope now, worn and soft-edged from so many hands and years. She looked at it like it might speak if she stared long enough. The mother's locket rested against her chest, the clasp fixed, the chain polished. It struck her that silence had once felt like safety, and now it just felt like shame. "You don't have to do it," the mother said softly. The daughter didn't answer at first. She turned the envelope over in her hands. "You're sure?" she asked finally. The mother's throat ached, but she nodded. Double quotes, yes. The station lights buzzed faintly above them, casting the platform in a pale yellow glow. There was no one else here tonight, just the hush of the tracks and the faint smell of snow coming. The daughter slid her nail under the flap of the envelope. The mother's breath caught, but she didn't stop her this time. The paper tore with a sound that reminded her of his voice when it cracked. The daughter pulled the papers out and looked down at them. Names and numbers and truths that had once seemed impossible. The mother stared at the bench across from them. Empty now. She remembered sitting here alone in her tattered coat, watching couples hurry past, too ashamed to ask for help, too afraid to go back home. How many nights had she whispered one more night to herself, just to keep breathing? And how many nights had he spent alone since she left, realizing his name didn't mean what it used to? Because she'd seen it in his eyes the last time, just a flicker. When the second envelope slid across the table and he opened it, the cruel mask finally cracked. Not just anger, not just guilt, but a small, sharp fear of being seen for who he really was. Even monsters are afraid of the mirror. Her daughter began tearing the papers in half, then half again. She handed a piece to her mother, who took it with steady fingers. The two of them worked in silence, shredding the evidence into pieces so small they were no longer dangerous. The mother let one slip from her hand and watched it flutter down to the platform, like a snowflake. She realized the real proof wasn't in the papers anymore. It was in the fact that she was still here. The daughter looked at her, a faint smile tugging at her mouth. "You're sure about this?" she asked again. This time the mother smiled. "Yes," she said. "I waited long enough." And she had. The station clock ticked above them, a slow reminder that time kept moving whether you asked it to or not, if justice still matters. "You'll want the next page." They stood at last, brushing the scraps from their laps. The daughter took her hand, and the mother squeezed it, feeling the quiet strength there. All around them, the pieces of the yellow envelope lay scattered like snow-dot, and for the first time in years she didn't feel cold. The mother finally whispered, "Let's go home." Some stories don't end. They echo. The bench was warmer than she expected. Warm from sun, from memory, from years of someone else sitting here and willing the night to pass. She ran her fingers over the wood grain, and it felt smooth now, as though grief had polished it over time. Her little girl wiggled in her lap, soft curls sticking to her cheek, and she pressed a kiss to the top of her head. The station was nearly empty at this hour, the afternoon light slanting gold through the tall windows. Dust floated in the air like the last traces of a long-forgotten winter. She remembered being here herself. Small, furious, holding a yellow envelope she thought would split her mother's world in half. She'd stood right here, shouted her name, made strangers turn and stare. But the photo hid something worse. And when her mother finally whispered the truth, it was not destruction that came, it was release. Her daughter's little fingers reached toward the locket she wore now. She opened it with a tiny snap and held it out for her. Inside was the same picture it had always held, but it didn't hurt to look at it anymore. Even pain can soften into something you can hold without breaking. Little girl's lips formed a question, but no sound came. She simply stared at her mother, waiting, as though she already knew some answers and only needed the words. "This is where my mother taught me to stop waiting," she said softly to both of them. The girl nodded solemnly, though she couldn't possibly understand yet. She let her thumb trace the edge of the locket before she closed it again and tucked it back against her skin. For a long moment, she stayed quiet. The station clock ticked. A lone pigeon cooed from the rafters. She used to tell me, she went on, that silence can eat you alive. She waited here for years, hoping someone else would speak first. And then she learned. Her voice thickened, but she didn't stop. She learned she didn't need permission to leave the story behind. The little girl snuggled closer, her breath warm on her mother's shoulder. And then she heard it, the echo, her mother's laugh. Faint, carried not by sound but memory. The kind of laugh she'd only heard years later, when it was all over, when she finally stopped hiding from herself. But even then, that laugh had sounded a little broken. Even monsters are afraid of the mirror. She thought of him too, her father, sitting in a cell somewhere, his name stripped of power, his anger folded inward. The day the sentence was read, he'd looked at her just once, and for the first time she'd seen fear in his eyes. Not fear of her, fear of himself. She wondered if he'd ever learned to speak the truth in that cold little room. Her daughter tugged at her sleeve. "Tell me again," she said softly. The mother smiled at that double quotes yes. She whispered. So she told the story, not the tragedy. Not anymore. She told it as testament. She told her about the bench, and the snow, and the whisper of one more night that her mother clung to like prayer beads. She told her about the envelopes and the birth certificates and the locket that had nearly choked her mother with its weight. She told her about the night. The police lights bled through the curtains, and she finally stood up. About how her mother's silence broke in that living room and shattered all of them in different ways. And she told her how the silence never came back. Her little girl's eyes were wide now, shining in the afternoon light. She smoothed her hair back gently and pressed another kiss to her temple. If justice still matters, you'll want the next page. And she thought of what her mother had said, her last words before she died, a faint smile playing at her lips as she lay in the hospital bed. She waited, her mother had whispered. And it was worth it. The train rumbled past outside the window, and the bench gleamed faintly in the light, no longer a place of waiting, but of beginning. And in her heart, she whispered back, she waited. And it was worth it.